This business being what it is, it's funny to see the way things come fully around. And Salvador belongs to MGM, the lion, the roaring lion. In my youth, it was a symbol of respectability, MGM, and to think of Salvador, which was done under very renegade conditions, as being part of the MGM library is kind of funny, but that was in the old days. The opening credits are based in real footage of one of the shootings in San Salvador, the capital, at the church. And we thought that by repeating it, it was a very nice title design. Robert Dawson designed the titles. I think he came up with the idea of repetition, which is nice in titles of different colors. Salvador was done as it was really as a scam. I mean, it was done as a scam because the picture was stolen in a sense. It was in all its details. If you look back, you'd say, how did we do it? We couldn't do it again, ever. We couldn't ever reduplicate the circumstances that allow for a crime to happen. You're dependent on luck. We said the picture would cost $2-point-something million when we really didn't think it would, and we found out quickly that we were way over our heads. In a country, in Mexico, that there was a lot of chaos in the planning. On the other hand, if we'd ever told the truth, we never would have been able to make the movie. So it never would have happened. In those days, I was willing to lie to achieve the greater end. So I'll never be one of those people who will always condemn the people who use any means necessary, because I'd been one of those violators myself. So it's not an easy issue. It's very ambivalent in life. And it's funny how years later you're forced by the system, you're boxed in a sense, to work the system's way, paying people the way they do. Unions and pension plans and taxes and all that and insurances, and before you know it, your film like Salvador would easily cost $20-25 million today. It eventually went over budget to about $4 million, maybe 4.5. I'm not sure, because I lost track in the madness. And John Daly put up the money. John Daly of Hemdale, who was a interesting and unique man who I met in my life, boxing promoter, was in the Congo with the Ali fight, Rumble in the Jungle, and I went to jail for it, actually. Went to jail was for some sort of weird taxes in the Congo, and got out of the deal. But John put up the money and backed it when it faltered. This is the introduction we shot late in the movie. My son, Sean, who is newly born, is playing Richard Boyle's child, and Maria Pitillo is his wife, his Italian wife, based on the true story of Richard Boyle. We were all new to each other. Me to Jimmy Woods, Jimmy to me, Bob Richardson, the cameraman, Bruno Rubello, the production designer, Gerald Green, the producer, the line producer, and Richard, who was our source. Richard was the source of the story, and we decided to go that way. And he was hanging around, and it was funny, because Jimmy would, in creating this character, of course, had to cut off from the real character at one point. All actors do, I think, and he couldn't deal with the reality of Boyle anymore. So Boyle took a back seat, because Jimmy would say, I'm better than the real Boyle. Jimmy would always be competitive and would always compare himself to somebody. I'm better than the real Boyle. But he was, in some ways, in his ability to condense his behavior. And to have the same skin tone to the whole movie is important. Because I think Richard would have changed skin tones. When we did video tests with Richard early on, I was so low in our funds that we were considering casting Richard as himself, as well as the real Dr. Rock from San Francisco. And there were two uglier characters you couldn't imagine in a car. But actually, I shot a video test of them, and in the video test, Richard turned colors, because he'd been drinking back then. So he'd be red, and I don't think he is anymore, but he would be a little red in one shot, he'd be green in another one, a little bluish tint in the other one. It was very funny to see the changes. And when John Daly first saw the makeup test, he said, you want to put that man in the movie? I think Jimmy caught very well the reckless quality that Boyle had in his life, that the devil may care, fly by the seat of the pants. There is no laws. There is no civilization that I respect. There is no morality.
You've got 43 unpaid parking tickets.
Jesus.
Nothing is legal about your car.
That's San Francisco, of course, and Sue Ann McKean, who was one of the top professional bodybuilders, is playing a policewoman, which was a first of its kind, I think. In looking back on the film, I'm surprised at how well shot it was by Bob Richardson, how clean a look, how crisp. That's funny, at the time I remembered it as sort of a muddied, fly by the seat of their pants, Boyle-like film, put together a grainy documentary-like, and yet when you look at it, it really amazed me how much quality Bob had been able to save, given the conditions he had. kind of politically incorrect dialogue that only you can do sometimes when you're free. You don't care about what other people think or what you have your characters say. San Francisco is a very evocative opener, and the desert's a closer. We shot this in San Francisco, and then we moved over to Las Vegas and finished the movie in the 50th day, approximately 50 days of shooting. We ran out of funds in Mexico on the 42nd day, and were struck by the crew hard this time, and I think we were basically removed from the country because of fiscal problems that were starting to develop. The banks have a lot of power in Mexico, as does the government, and they were asking us to leave, I think, in a very nice way, which was sort of get out of here. And we got out fast and had to reshape the entire crew in the U.S. spontaneously, and I had to get the money from John to shoot the beginning and the end, this beginning and the end in Vegas. They give the film the framing quality from the blues of San Francisco to the yellows of the desert at the end. You'll see America frames Mexico. Based on, again, a true incident with Dr. Rock and his dog. And per Richard, of course, he's Irish, so you'll believe about 50% of what he says. But per Richard, this is pretty much the way it happened with his wife, in terms of her leaving him, leaving a message on the door, and leaving with their newborn baby because of his drinking. Jimmy got nominated for the Academy Award, Best Actor, which was amazing, and from where we came from and started and ended, and it shows you how much of an illusion Hollywood is. You can be a nobody and make an Academy Award-winning nomination one day. I also got nominated against myself in the screenplay division, original screenplay, for Salvador with Richard, and against Platoon, which I had written. I won neither. Woody Allen won that year for Hannah and Her Sisters, which was beautifully written film. I love this montage. I think this montage has been written about nicely in terms of its scope and rhythm. It certainly is fast and gets you down south. Changes are big. Some of my favorite dialogue in the movie is in the car. I think some of this dialogue made enemies right away in people who don't share the sense of humor. These are not necessarily my views. Jim Belushi was a television actor, really. I'd seen him one night randomly in Saturday Night Live, I think it was. He'd done a skit called White Man Rapping, where he was wearing these ridiculous pants and doing this imitation of a white man trying to rap. And I thought it was really hilarious, and so was his manner. And I thought of him for Rock, Dr. Rock. It worked for these two, and the irony of the thing is that they were not particularly friendly during the shooting. They were not happy with each other, and there was a lot of friction, actually, because James was his first movie, his first big movie anyway, and has a big role, and Jimmy had done quite a few and was telling Jim how to act. Jimmy was very smart, would know camera lenses and know exactly when his face was in and out, whereas Jim would not, and James would take advantage of it and in a very competitive way. But that's the way James is, and it's, be it as it may, it makes you work harder to do what you do, to be seen. And I think that Jim started to figure that out during the course of the shoot, and started to come back at Jimmy with a lot of his own development. So there was constant friction. But it didn't hurt the film for some reason. So there you go. It shows you that they say sometimes a husband and a wife are the best friends and make the most boring films, And Juan Fernandez is just wonderful. His face stood out. And fortunately, he just did a lot of B films after this. He always played the same villain over and over again. Nobody would give him a break. He's an interesting guy, actually. Very talented and colorful. Now, Boyle, I think, described to me a situation somewhat less than this. And of course, we dramatized it up, as we did several things in the movie. Now that different kinds of movies have been made that have advanced the subject of government repression, I would probably do this in a different way. Probably lighten it up a bit and try to. It would be less on the nose. I think. I think at the time I did this, this was one of the few reactions to the recent Reagan administration. For 6 years, had been swamping American foreign policy with its, I believe, toxins. There was a very toxic American progressive formula. And we were backing the death squads in Central America and South America. And people forget now that we're very close to invading Nicaragua militarily in 1985 and 1986. We saw numerous reserve troops down there. that were probably there not, with knowledge of the American public. There was also reserves from Texas being sent over to Honduras. There was additional military personnel in Honduras and all kinds of weirdos in Salvador. It was hard to figure out who was who. Honduras looked to me exactly like early Vietnam. It was that thick with American personnel. People who incidentally did not remember Vietnam. So this was 1985 when we first went to Salvador and Honduras and these places. Costa Rica was being militarized, contrary to its treaties. The outrage that Boyle and I felt about Salvador was direct and came right from the truth as we saw it. And we wrote the screenplay as almost agitprop cinema, saying this is a wrong system. America is backing the bad guy, and Boyle attacks that forthright in a speech. But we felt that way, and it was, as I said, one of the few reactions to the Reagan administration policy. It was as if amnesia existed in America about Vietnam. There hadn't been any acknowledgement of the other balance in American life, that Vietnam could have been dead wrong. And this is what Platoon made successful. Platoon was successful in part because of its timing, too, that it came out in '86 when Oliver North was found out, and the Reagan administration momentum to attack Nicaragua came to a quick end in late '86 when Platoon came out, because the Oliver North scandal had broken, the movie helped. I mean, everything reminded people that there had been a past where Americans questioned our policy abroad, which they had not done for those 5-6 years. It had been very quiet in America. Reagan's last 2 years, from '86 to '88, were sort of a lame duck administration. It was his probably most ineffective 2 years, and he backed off the military position in South America, Central America, and worldwide, and even came to an agreement with Gorbachev, the beginning of the agreements with the Soviets, who would end the Cold War. So there's a very crucial time, actually, and Reagan was so close the other direction. Nobody even knows the story of 1983. There was a great story I've heard from several reliable people of how close we came to nuclear war with the Soviet Union. It was right after the time of the Korean jet that was shot down over the Soviet Union. The country just went the other way from '86 on. The moment the Oliver North scandal broke, some people referred at one time to the year of the two Olivers, because we were both named Oliver, but one was going in one direction, the other in another, south and north. I should have been called Oliver South, actually. It would have been funny, because I was heading in that south anyway, as far as they were concerned. Going south. It was a strange time, good time for comedy, but not much in the way of good drama or protest films. I looked at the Russian school of the 1920s, sort of expressionistic propaganda films, or agitprop. They called them agitprop films. Potemkin, Eisenstein's earliest films among them. The 10 Days That Shook the World. Strike. These were models of the degree to which we could push the anger and push the directness of the film. In hindsight, this seems to me very defiant of the system as it existed in '86, '85, and at the same time, I mean, it had to be done at this price, or because it would have been subject to huge failure and ridicule if it had been done for more, which is an irony that pervades to this day. You have to figure out a way to make these films cheaper all the time. In Mexico, you can pull off a lot, though. I still think you can. I still think you have big problems in the States, so. The orgy scene where they went in to see Colonel Figueroa, who's played by Jorge Luque, who was one of my heroes from my youth. Saw him in several Mexican films and a couple of American westerns where he played Indians or Mexicans. He was very good always, and very handsome man. Got to work with him. Unfortunately, that scene was cut down for the R-rated version that was released by Hemdale. I had a lot of problems with the cutting of this film to make it ready for release, and much of the explicitness of the sex, particularly in some of the violence, was lost, including the concept of having an orgy and discussing information, military information among the men, and Colonel Figueroa giving them very pregnant information that would be very vital to their survival later. That was lost. So Boyle left that orgy knowing a lot more, and the scene now seems to me forced and cut the way it's cut. It moves at a pace, though. Here, of course, he catches up with Maria, who's played by the beautiful Elpidia Carrillo, who was partly Indian from the state of Michoacan, I believe, just north of Mexico City. Elpidia had a very haunted quality, a beautiful haunted quality, and realistic face, realistic to the peasantry of Mexico, very intense. Petey had appeared in several pictures before. Two pictures about gringos caught down south, sort of like in the Wild Bunch, but they were The Border with Jack Nicholson and Under Fire with Nick Nolte, which is an excellent Central American film, and Christopher Columbus. John Savage was a coup for us to get him because he was known from Deer Hunter and various other films. He'd been a very distinguished actor and still was. We were very proud to get him in the film, and especially for a third role, which was John Cassidy, who was really sort of a stand-in for John Hoagland, who was a Newsweek, I believe, photographer who had done some great work in Salvador and I think in Lebanon, and was killed and was known by many people in the press corps as one of the top guys, and he was killed, I believe, in Salvador. John brought the dignified intensity to that role. I have no idea what the real man was like. I didn't know him, and we didn't have the luxury of rewriting too much, given the schedule we had.
No bullshit.
John has a very dead-ahead stare. He takes his time, which is a very gentle quality, very sensitive.
Bodies up there.
This was based on an interpretation of El Playón, which is a known burial ground, but it's a little bit hotter than it really was. It's more exaggerated than it was. But as I said again, this was sort of a movie that was done in the concept of, being very strong in its agitprop and getting the attention. Otherwise, it did disappear in theaters. Frankly, it didn't last very long. It opened in April of 1986. And it died with mixed reviews, and people didn't know what to make of it. It didn't have any stars. And it was called a documentary title called Salvador, although to me it stood for something else, the concept of Savior, which is a movie I later produced in time with Dennis Quaid as an actor about Serbia. It's called Savior, very nice movie. But Salvador came and went and basically became more of a hit. It was successful theatrically in the first-run situations in Los Angeles, where among younger people, and was known that way, but really was not anything much in between. And New York had bad reviews, as usual. So it died quickly and was removed from theaters. It was released by Hemdale, which had no experience at releasing and had no muscle to deal with. So it made its name ultimately on video when it came out later in the year, and made its biggest name off the impact of Platoon that came out the same year in December of '86. Platoon carried the knowledge of Salvador, and it was talked about and nominated for Academy Awards. But it was all mostly off the video that people saw this movie, and it was one of those anomalies that come and go, and you're grateful for it. So on the other hand, you wish that more people had seen the movie, because memory goes. Very few people remember this movie, actually, or even know that I made it. I rarely see it mentioned when my credits are mentioned. It's too bad. I'm proud of it. Some critics really can be nasty, but they say that this is the best movie I ever made, which is kind of depressing considering that I've made other movies since then. But it's something you have to live with. Some people only like your first work, and it can never be other, because that's sort of the place they discover you, and they fall in love with that concept of discovery. They don't look at the new work with the same objectivity. It's too bad. There is a process of subjectivity, this thing, of falling in love with a filmmaker, or hating a filmmaker, or falling out of love. These are processes that go on. One doesn't have much control over that. One is the object of desire or of contempt. Salvador was not my first film, by the way. It was my third feature film that I directed. The bibliographies have it correct when they said that The Seizure was my first one in 1973. It was released by Cinerama. It's a horror film. My next film was The Hand with Michael Caine, 1981, from Orion. But both films were not ready for what I could do. I was learning my trade. At the same time, I was compromised. I wasn't able to express myself as freely as I wanted to for various reasons, among them financial, mostly financial. So it's this film I could finally say I can take credit for being one of the authors, or the author, or the main author. I really felt like everything came together for this film at the beginning of this career in Hollywood, and continued to come together for a period of time. This film opened doors, but Platoon really opened the big doors, and after that, having been waiting in the wings for a long time, I rushed through 10 years and 10 movies, big movies, some of them 2 movies in one, just because I was hungry to make movies. And I got to do what I wanted to do for 10 years, pretty much without too much, waiting. which was years of waiting had preceded it. And waiting can drive you crazy sometimes, but sometimes it can make you wise. But there'd been a lot of waiting for this Salvador, and Salvador was an explosion of energy, as was Platoon, both pretty much back-to-back films shot, one in Mexico, one in the Philippines, with the same man. The man had said to me, John Daly had said to me something like, which film do you want to do first, Platoon or Salvador? It was like being asked, which girl do you want, the blonde or the brunette? It was a question I doubted. And I said, there's no way I'm going to do Platoon because I've tried to get that on so many times and failed. But it would be bad luck, and it would curse the film if I said Platoon, and somehow Daly would die of a heart attack or the money would go away. So I told him Salvador. And we made Salvador first, and he lived up to his word, unlike many times in my career. And he actually made the second movie, and we called it Platoon, and he benefited off it, thank God. But years later, John was right when he said that if I had said, let's do Platoon first, and Platoon had been an international success that it was, that Salvador would have benefited enormously if it had been done as a second film. And it would probably have led more openly to the sequel, which we had in mind, which is hilarious, about Richard Boyle making it to Beirut, which is another based on a true story kind of movie where he's in Beirut, causing all kinds of problems on both sides of the Arab-Israeli border. Will McMillan plays the general, very good actor, and Colby Chester plays the CIA man, who I think I probably exaggerated a little bit. I put the first cavalry patch on the general a little bit big for Caro, but this was pre-Platoon. And Colby, I did as sort of my version of a CIA guy, with a little bit Ivy League, with the sweaters. Again, it's a little overdone, but I had fun with it. It was done in a surrealism, so to speak, of Spanish writers. Larger than life, Gabriel Marquez, exaggeration, lying, bigness, to make a point. There is something very strong to be said about that. I think I was working very much in that spirit in my early days. And as time went on, I probably became more realistic. Here, for example, it's a loud persona, but colorful dialogue nonetheless. I always liked that as a kid. Realistic films sometimes bore me because they go on, and you know it's reality, and you're impressed by the work, but it doesn't excite you ultimately as much as larger than reality. That's why I think we still love Hitchcock, because it makes situations that are larger than our ordinary lives. He states the Reagan position, I think, very much in vogue at that time. Don't forget that. And Reagan's quote that you saw earlier was exactly the quote that he gave about the Rio Grande, which was I believe his belief as late as 84, 85. He really hated the Nicaraguan rebels, the Sandinistas, who he called communists. I think he misunderstood the Nicaraguan desire for change. And he really backed a bunch of thugs, in my opinion, the Contras. And they were very, very pernicious people, somewhat akin to the Cuban freedom fighters blowing up airplanes in the name of fighting communism. We shot this at Cuernavaca at the hotel we actually lived in, the Intercontinental, I believe. Gilles Millinaire is on the left, French aristocrat, French-American aristocrat. That's Valerie Wildman, a wonderful actress, playing Pauline Axelrod, who is not a real person, but who is based on a bunch of TV reporters who Boyle ran across in the field in Salvador. And like many reporters all over the world, they made fun of him as sort of anchors, TV anchors from the big cities who wanted to look good on their makeup jobs and stay out of danger zones.
I resent democracy. I mean, what kind of democracy is it when you have to vote, and if you don't vote, you're branded a commie subversivo?
But this is very much a point of contention in Salvador, and it's not to be missed that you needed identity to walk around. As you do in many countries, you need an identity, and the identity is a way by which the government can keep track of you, too. As you know, in America, we're not required to have, at least not up until now, not required to have identity papers at all times, saying who we are. But the system is getting tighter. But these countries have already been there. Unless they are registered with the government, many of the people were mistaken for rebel sympathizers and killed or tortured.
Excuse me?
We shot in Mexico City, in Cuernavaca, in Acapulco area, and in Guerrero State. And we shot outside Cuernavaca in Tepoztlan and also in Tlayacapan, which was the city where we staged the final battle. We blew up quite a bit of it We didn't blow it up, and we added stories to certain buildings and blew those up. But the city allowed us to make quite a mayhem of this place. So we needed that city very badly to make this work, and it's amazing what we did to it for the money we had. Well, the mayor was a funny little fellow, and he was very happy to have us, and the town prospered actually from the investment we made, because it was a little out of the way, and it wasn't in the industrial sector. So it had suffered through time, but it was a beautiful old location to light a cup on. Once used for Magnificent Seven, and I think other films, it was a great backdrop, a historical backdrop for me, especially thinking about the Magnificent Seven. I knew we had something in this movie, I just knew it. In my gut, I felt like we had some energy that was going to work for us for a change. The mayor, we made his office into Figueroa's office, the office you saw where the orgy took place in the opening scene, where Figueroa met them in Mexico. So we turned his mayor's office into this red veloured whorehouse. And he liked it so much, he asked us to leave it. He asked us if he could leave it that way. And we said, okay. And the mayor was very happy with us. And then we blew up the town. Tony Plata has gone on to do many, 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 many movies. He already had been in a few, but by the time he did this, a very good actor. See him regularly on TV. He's a real pro, always interesting and colorful. He played our fictional equivalent of Roberto d'Aubuisson, who became famous at the time for his radical statements publicly about the communists, and was a right-wing candidate for president of Arana Party, IRANA. Apparently was a Hitler fan, and many people suspect was behind the shooting of Archbishop Romero, who was the Archbishop and the most powerful spiritual leader of Salvador, and who was killed by a sniper, a government right-wing sniper, apparently. This is a fictionalized version of what may have happened. Again, I think probably not, but I think it was done for camera. It was dressed up in a tabloid kind of sensational outfit, but powerful nonetheless. John Doe, the singer.
The whole thing next week. Scouts on.
And d'Aubuisson was famous for, this is a little detail, but this is the stuff that gets saved, hopefully, by history, and that somebody like Richard Boyle remembers that he did those great watermelon ads on TV for, green on the outside, red inside. But, yes, it's part of history, but who remembers it? Who puts it down on film or in a book form that we can actually cherish that memory? That's the beauty of this stuff. It gets forgotten, unfortunately, most of it. It gets lost in the sands of history. Oh, my God. The guy looks like a gorilla, right? These are faces that come from Central Casting in Mexico. I don't know, I picked the worst guys I could find, I guess. Shameless. These guys were in Peckinpah movies, I guess, and worse. They were in 1950s westerns. They got most of their habits from there. These guys probably shot John Wayne. No, they never got killed, but they probably shot a few guys in their time. Katie Girardo in this film, she was a film commissioner of one of these provinces. And I remember what a gracious and lovely woman. She was one of the great second female leads of the 50s. She was in so many westerns with John Wayne and many other people. She was always the dignified, beautiful, or dangerous Mexican woman. And she had that same beautiful face, although older and heavier, but she was so beautiful. And she had that same radiance. It was a professional radiance that she maintained. And I admired that discipline very much. She was also very helpful to us. All these qualities, well, obviously she was helpful to us, but she was a great lady in her dignity, in her acceptance of age and her transcendence through time. If you're a movie star and you get to that place, it's a gracious and glorious place where you can accept the passage of time. I think this night was a hard night, a lot of tense shooting, and I think there was a huge fight between Jimmy and James. As I remember it, they broke out. It was hard to finish this scene. It can get tense, an actor pushes another actor, or whatever happens, and before you know it, it gets physical. Richard told me a story about Carlos, who was the nephew of Maria Elpidia being beheaded, and we incorporated it in the movie because it's a stunning story. But we did pile event upon event. There's no question that we jammed it together insofar as we combined Carlos with the shooting of the Archbishop as well as the Battle of Santa Ana and various other incidents are jammed together. And I think it's, if this movie were purporting to be reality, I would say it's too much. It just is too much. But I allowed this to happen because of the license we gave ourselves as a fotonovela, I guess, a jamming together of incidents. No one man could have witnessed it all. The nuns, too, the killing of the American nuns was combined. So no man could be witness to all of it, nor was Richard a witness to the Archbishop Romero murder, as it's depicted here.
You do, sir.
Michael Murphy, who you see as Ambassador Kelly, I used because he was very effective in the Robert Altman films that I'd seen growing up. And I liked very much his liberal demeanor, mild-mannered, polite, and yet at the same time straightforward and straight in a way, but at the end of the day, weak. He didn't deliver, a loser. And I think that's the sort of the role he played a little bit in the Altman films. He was never the hero, but he was a man who had complexities on his face. Unfortunately, a lot of the liberals, based on American diplomats abroad, were overruled by the Reagan administration. They just got killed. You know, the State Department is sometimes more liberal because they have career appointees. Robert White, I believe, was the ambassador to Salvador, and I read the book by Raymond Bonner called Deceit by Weakness, and in that book he really goes after the people in the Reagan administration for their involvement with the death squads, but he does point up the failure of American liberalism and the liberals in the State Department to deal with it and to turn back the tide. They just had no chance. They just had no chance.
Nobody just disappears in El Salvador. They got him.
Robert White, the ambassador, ultimately, to his honor, resigned in protest against Reagan's policies in Salvador and took the hit and was dropped out of the State Department, which was, outside of politics. That was his career. He gave it up. A man of principle. But ultimately he lost. And I think in the Cartesian view of longevity, the winner is the one who survives and the loser is not. So in that regard, the liberals lose. They always lose to people like Reagan, it seems. And it only rights itself when the right goes too far to the right and gets overwhelmed with war or something. And then the country hopefully keeps a balance and a flex on the system that the muscle pulls back in the other direction. On the other hand, Murphy projects a solidness, a heaviness of weight, authority inside the system, corporateness that Boyle lacks. Boyle feels like the weaker man here by far. And Murphy is the one who can save him in the end. He has the authority to do so. I think this is a natural fit for Jimmy Woods because the role called for nervousness, physicality, and look at this detail of his performance, the way he has all these nervous moves, but they're never monotonous, frankly. They're very fresh each time. Cindy Gibb, a very cute young actress who played in some television and very new to the business. It was a delight casting her. She was such a perky personality on the set, and she was everything I dreamed her to be, a sweetheart to work with. It's staged, I thought, nicely with going through three characters there, walking out with Cindy, crossing Belushi, and ending here. And this dialogue just caught fire between them. It was one of those good days when two actors are in sync. Or the dialogue's right. This fellow was our still photographer, Gary. That's his real accent, and I cast him on the spot because he felt like real. He was a foreign shooter. Became our still photographer one time, I think, on this film. I don't know if he did any other films after. But he was a real field hand and knew his stuff. Gary plays the bureau chief, where the bureau chief pulls him away. But he was a real photographer in life. He's Australian, and his accent, he's great. It shows you why Australian actors get away with it, because they have those accents that they can pause when they forget a line, and they can carry the pause. Gary's not a great actor, but he's very real, and that's what Australians always strike me in their movies. The actors seem very real. The beauty of Boyle is that he joins all sides, so he has to. It's a necessity, by any means necessary. I was talking about earlier. It's just he has to compromise. It's the nature of life. To get to the truth, you have to sort of uncorporate the feeling. You have to work both sides. It takes recklessness and fearlessness, hustle, the desire to want to get the truth out. Boyle becomes the conduit to the truth, only because he's willing to live with the chaos, in a way, and in his life. It certainly mirrors our picture the way it was shot. It was completely chaotic. From beginning to end, the most chaotic film I ever done, and I did several more chaotic ones, believe me. I mean, everything was like shooting two movies in one. This film was just monstrously hard to make because of the money. It was very short, and it was all in the con jobs. People were... We even had a phony origin in the sense that the tax bill from Holland that allowed the bank shelter to give us the money to make the movie in Mexico was based on their making another movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger that had been canceled called Outpost, which is hilarious because Outpost never got made, and we were made as Outpost. In other words, we moved our film, plugged it into that slot, and took the money from the Holland people, Per, Daly, and Gerald. And the Holland people ended up in jail. One of the people did on a fraud charge. So I don't know where it all begins, you see. There's fraud all the way up the line. But, fraud in commerce can be good because look what it leads to. Ultimately, it led to a decent movie that was made from this fraud. And who gets the worst for it? I mean, the guys in Holland broke the law, but they were great characters because they gave birth to this movie. Who can hate them? They should be applauded forever, in my opinion, and they should be acknowledged with an Oscar for financial chicanery to make the movie, selling your mother. That's what it takes sometimes, and unfortunately, some people lose their minds doing it, They lose their minds. They just lose all sense of proportionality in their lives because they always take risks, and that always taking risks puts you out there. And I felt that myself as a director over many pictures, those 10 pictures I did in a row. I was taking huge risks for myself and each time exposing myself to huge new influences very quickly. And that certainly affects the way you respond to humanity. It definitely does. And, you have to take people in shorter breaths, it becomes very hard. You need longer breaths with each person in a way, and you do. You need to spend time, and you don't have it. So you have to make an adjustment where sometimes you give up time for something else to watch your daughter grow up. That's been a pleasure, frankly. It's been one of the great privileges of my life to know somebody completely.
Estados Unidos repetidas veces.
This is the text of the Archbishop's speech, amended, somewhat cut, but it's basically the intent and meaning, in some cases, exact verbiage of what he said. In other words, it was the least rewritten of the speeches I've done. We found a wonderful theater actor from Mexico, done very little film, actually, because in Mexico, film was regarded as corrupting, television especially. Theater was highly regarded, and he was one of the top theater actors, and he really, I guess might have been the Paul Scofield of his country, and stepped forward and just did this monologue for us. And one splendid day, he kept the intensity up through the day, as only a professional can. Kept the same level, could do it from any angle, and with honesty, and marvelous man to work with. One of that race of actors that you have to admire for being just actors. They make acting noble. Well, the imagery is a little on the simplistic side, but it's also powerfully clean, and I don't know, it's big. It's movie-like. We were very proud getting these shots. These are big shots, hard to do, large crowds, little time. Making more would do with less, and we created an environment that was very thick. An old church down in one of the older sections of Mexico City. Tough shot to get, but a big one. That one too. Had to hook the camera up at the steeple. A lot of extras these days. Big, thick sets. I mean, we couldn't make this film like a guerrilla operation in the middle of Mexico City, believe me. We had to be out there and, do it legally. Set things up, firearms, equipment, special effects, insurances. Well, that's the way we operated. So we did things legally in Mexico as best we could. But as I said, we ran out of money, or the company ran out of money, and some of the checks were going bad, I think. It was really embarrassing to be involved with these people. I tried to keep a distance, and at one point it got so bad that one of the strikes, there were several strikes now, by the crew who hadn't been paid on the right day, I just gave up and went to the car and lay down and fell asleep, which was sort of my state of mind. I just said, well, if it's going to be, it's going to be. And I'll wake up. And I was woken up a couple hours later, and they said, they're back at work now. So we went back to work. We just dropped 2 hours. It was an environment constantly of hassles. In other words, from the rear or the front, it wasn't ever going to stop. Whether it was Jimmy giving me a hard time on the front, because, Jimmy is a very alert actor, and he wants you to know that he knows a lot, and he sometimes wants you to know he knows more than you do. So, you have your battles with Jimmy. And he keeps you alert, believe me. He doesn't waste a beat. His eyes are always open. And Bob Richardson, these guys are tough. I mean, they're good because they're tough, and that you have to keep up with them. And they're good pacers. And in the back, you got the money falling apart all the time. Every day, you got Gerald Green with his long face coming down in this impeccable Graham Greene accent. My dear boy, we're really in bad shape. We're really in bad shape. I really think the film is going to have to fold now. I mean, his kind of dialogue was always doom and gloom, it was pure Dickens. And I would go reeling, my head would go reeling off into spirals of nightmares, upon nightmares. I won't finish this film. I've killed myself. I'm killing myself. I'm killing everybody. And I can't even have a guarantee in my hand that I can edit this film and finish it, much less shoot it. It was dying inside. And every day there would be another threat financially. And we have to cut this, we have to cut that. And then one day it just collapsed. I mean, Gerald tried his hardest to fool everybody and keep the shell game going as long as he could. And for that, he's another hero like the Dutchman. And I've always given him full credit, Gerald Green, as the line producer and main producer of the movie in sense of putting together the Mexican tax shelter with John Daly. John was the financier out of Los Angeles, but Gerald was the Mexican realtor. In fact, they'd been to jail together in Mexico years before, which is the reason I think John Daly never set foot in Mexico when I was there. I think it was a funny story. But Gerald was a character out of a book. Also, you could do a movie like a Richard Boyle version, another type of movie about Gerald Green and his life. But you need Alec Guinness to play him as a young man. That's my first AD, Ramon Menendez, who went on to be a director in his own right. The man wearing the red glasses right here. He's hilarious in this role. That's Ramon, and he organized the crew. He was so good. He was first time doing his first AD. I mean, first time, but he was doing a great job. And Jimmy Woods one day would walk off the set, and Ramon was his buddy, because he was the first. And he'd say, Jimmy, what's wrong? What's wrong? And then Jimmy would complain out loud to him, and everybody would overhear about me and this and this and this. And Ramon would say, oh, but, this is Oliver. Blah, blah, blah. He'd calm him down. And eventually, one day it was too much. Jimmy walked off the set. In the middle of a bombing and everything, airplanes are going off and big money. Jimmy walks off the set furious, and he gets away from Ramon and gets on the road and starts, thumbing a ride back to America, I guess. That's where he told Ramon he was going, back to America. Thumbing a ride down the highway. So I think Ramon, being clever and a fox that he is, not me, put out an alert to all the local APBs, to the cops, saying there was a guy on loose on the highway who was nuts, to bring him back to the base camp as quickly as possible. So the Mexicans wouldn't recognize him if he'd stopped a police car. They would have thought he was a nut. Anyway, he had to outfox Jimmy, but Jimmy eventually came back, I think. He was picked up on a bus, that's it. He was picked up on a bus. Ramon went all the way out there, miles away, found him on a bus, and they got him off. Talked him back to the set, and he continued shooting. I worked 2 more times with Jimmy on Nixon and Any Given Sunday, and enjoyed both times working with him. So I've seen him at various ages of his life, in various moods. And I guess he's my longest co-star. Yeah, I was watching my back financially all the time. It was a tremendous pressure from the rear and the front. I imagine I must have cracked up internally from stress inside several times, but I wouldn't show it. I toughed it out. I looked at it as an infantry experience, akin to something I went through in Vietnam, and I was determined to make this movie. So I looked at hardship as a given, and frankly, many people still think I do. In terms of when I try not to be spoiled on the film sets, I try to keep it austere and tight, because distractions do get in the way, and they slow it down and they make it headier but more expensive experience. And if you can keep the background bullshit down, you can keep the foreground up. And I think that's the problem in a lot of movies. Too much background bullshit. It drags you down. It drags me down anyway. And the budgets get ridiculous, and it becomes behind the scenes. There's above the line, below the line, and behind the scenes, the third category. The money that never gets on the screen. We did this movie with a really fractured crew of a few Americans, mostly Mexican, few internationals. Everything was done by first-timers or older veterans, depending on what department. There were some vets on the show who enjoyed it. And it got done, it got done Mexican style. It might be a couple of tapes and an old piece of equipment, but it would still work. Cranes, there were no such thing. Remotes, no such thing. None of the modern gadgetry, no video, monitor, nothing like that. The last day of shooting was an horror show, the very last day, the 50th day. The new post-production supervisor at that time was replacing the fellow from Mexico who had been the line producer. The line producer had not been paid. This is not Gerald Green, the American line producer, the production manager, call it what you will, the man who's in charge of the nuts and the bolts, but Gerald was the boss of the movie. Anyway, this guy decided that he wasn't going to be paid. He was worried that he wasn't going to be paid or his checks were no good. So he held on to the negative the last day. Of all the last day's footage, it was crucial. It had the ending of the movie. And he took it out, and I remember him in the desert disappearing with all this footage and wondering what was going to happen. But that was his bond for being paid, and he got paid, I guess. By the way, the last day, when you see the bus go out to the location there, I had no idea where it was. There had been no time to pre-scout the location, so I led the entire caravan into the desert that morning, not knowing where I was going. It was hilarious. I was in the lead car, and I was pointing, reading the map and pointing out to various places in the desert, and I found a place I really liked. It was this desert with mountain, good landscape, and we shot there the last scene that you see in the movie. It was totally unscouted, and it was funny to lead a car, like a military general leading 50 cars into a desert and not knowing where you're going. It was a very great moment. Being a movie director has got certain highs, you know. You can actually convince yourself you're Alexander the Great or Porthos III going into battle with your elephants or something. So Cindy Gibb ends up being the youngest nun who was killed by the death squads, the famous murderers. In the news, it seemed like it was only the death of the nuns that got through to the American people, the death of the American nuns, Irish Catholic nuns in Salvador. There'd been a tradition of many Irish nuns and fathers down there. I met quite a few. This is one of my first stage battles. It's a little corny, but it's fun. It took a long time to shoot. It was complicated. Again, look at the nervosity of Jimmy. Notice the Chaplin-esque moves. He's graceful, very graceful the way he moves. Very actor, but in a good way, I think. He makes everything a little bit bigger. The way he jumps up and down. It's a Peter Pan, young boy quality to him. He's a very physical person, a very good dancer, probably. I can see why women like him. A lot of women do. Of course, like with the ambassador, I think John Savage plays somewhat the same role as in the sense that he's a force of moral authority that Boyle would never attain. But see what happens to John Savage as a result of this belief system. He might decide that the Boyle way of living life is safer. The weather was changing on us all the time. So I would shoot through the weather. That's where I adopted my method of shooting, was to figure out a way to justify it. And we more or less have in every film. I mean, we very rarely have stopped because of weather. Only very inclement weather. We've managed to shoot something. It takes planning because you're trying to have a backup all the time, you know, but inside your own scene you might have some work to do that you can do without the light. You can create the light. This is a famous nuns massacre. They're raped and massacred by the death squads, paramilitaries, the unknowns. And at the time, it was a huge outcry in the United States. It was unexpected by the Reagan administration. And Alexander Haig, who was then Secretary of State, made himself famous for suggesting in a speech a response that, you know, we don't have any information, something to that effect. We don't have any information yet, but maybe the nuns were, you know, gun runners for the communists. It's possible. And that was like pretty shocking to some people who knew them well, who didn't have any basis. And I mean, anybody in the embassy who was serious would not have reported that unless it had been an ideological basis for that kind of information, which, given Haig's ideology, is rational. I mean, Haig became increasingly detached from reality, it seems to me. Jeannie Kirkpatrick at the United Nations suggested the same thing, and they both went on record at that. But of course, the missionaries, in the classical sense, were feared by the paramilitaries because they did practice, many of these people practiced forms of Catholic Church stuff where, you know, humanist church of South America, where you pass on the concept of doubt, the concept of questions and choices, the questions of individual liberty and consciousness. These are questions that would only be raised inside the Catholic and agrarian movements or land reform movements. That's how it gets started, or union. And these ideas get killed off by the people who go after these people right away in a lot of these countries. Land is a big issue south of the border, big issue, unlike the United States, because we're mostly city dwellers. But that's what Chiapas is about in Mexico now. Even when we were in Guerrero, there was a lot of fighting going on that we didn't know about. It was up in the hills. We heard about it. We once shot in a village here, where you see him with the revolutionaries pretty soon. We shot in a village where you couldn't get in. The government could not get in. They were not allowed in. They were killed on the spot. And they let this village alone. They wouldn't pay any taxes. They weren't part of the system. I don't know if they were getting government utilities or how that worked, but all I know is this village existed outside time as its own village. and obviously had sympathies for the rebels in that area. So there's a lot of upcountry stuff going on that most tourists don't see.
You know, rumor has it that they may have run the roadblock and there was an exchange of gunfire.
See? That's what she sort of represents the Hague position.
Because they don't have their
They don't have it, the surgical mask.
This is the actual dialogue of what was said in an excuse.
I knew Kathy Moore, Colonel. There's no way you're gonna sell me that shit. Sir, General Garcia.
At least we responded to it. I forgot that we had. That's why I said that.
We have the Fox and you.
It seemed to me at the time, from memory, that Robert White, the ambassador at that time, who was a liberal in the State Department, was a friend of the Cindy Gibb character, and was livid when it happened and upset. Knew what Reagan was up to in Central America and opposed it, and started to oppose it more and more. But ultimately did not have the power to change the course of things, which stayed bad for up until '86. Basically, the war stalled out. A lot of pain, a lot of death and destruction. No result, except the worsening of a country, the cheapening of a country. I enjoyed this, but I got a little heavy-handed with the music here, going to the rebel camp. I wanted to pay homage to my concept of what they were going through in the bush. But the music by a group that's very interesting, by the way, Mexican folkloric group, glorifies the rebels, the fighters. And for the life of me, I will never really know. I'm just going off information I received from people. I can't say. I have since visited Chiapas and met Commander Marcos and his group in the jungle. And it was quite an experience, and I saw quite a lot. But of course, what I saw was on the surface and what they wanted me to say. But I learned a lot.
West.
This was based on hearsay of what the rebel life was like. He was based on a Commander Villanueva, who was a hero to many people, including myself. I do believe these people were really fighting the good fight, like Castro did in Cuba, against dictators and evil and landowners that were terrible. And they have no reason to apologize to anybody for what they did. American media is very good at marginalizing, at pushing people towards the middle of homogeneity to agree. In other words, anybody radical, extreme, right or left with a history is marginalized in our society. You can't come back from that, you know. A general like this could never appear in Salvador and say, I'm going to be part of the progress of my country. No. He's been exposed as a leftist or as a rightist. It doesn't matter. You're really in dead trouble. Probably worse if you're a leftist. I mean, that general, I believe, is in London studying, or I don't know where he is. I have not seen any great leadership emerge in either Salvador or Nicaragua. What's amazing, out of a revolutionary spirit, what happened in those countries? What happened? The United States invested huge resources to destroy and burn and char the ashes of the revolutions in Nicaragua and Salvador. And they did. They killed them off. And Guatemala. They killed them off with bombs, satellite weaponry, watching, telling everything they could to the local forces, sharing weapons with them, sending military to Salvador to observe, advise, watch. Same thing in Guatemala for years, going back to 1960s. We've been heavily involved in. Actually, in 1954, there was a coup in Guatemala where we participated. CIA was first successful in getting rid of a foreign leader they thought was communist. And in a sense, the destabilization occurred in Guatemala is what tipped the balance. And the country devolved into a huge civil war against itself and amongst the Indians, wiping out almost all the Indians, and fighting amongst themselves in the most brutal way for 30 years until it just petered out from exhaustion. No side won, just death, torture, death squads. Incidentally, death squads, a lot of them studied in Vietnam. A lot of them was paid for by the American military or whatever, State Department or CIA, whatever, CIA probably, to go overseas and to study our way of dealing with Vietnamese torture, Vietnamese Inquisition. Must have been interesting to see inside the mind of one death torturer from Salvador in the middle of Da Nang with some Marine base, torturing some woman VC or suspected VC. Chile. Chile in 1972. We still was destabilized that. Nixon was heavily involved, as he was in Guatemala in 1954. So I'm saying that after the 80s revolutions, and basically Guatemala peters out, Salvador peters out, and Nicaragua peters out basically in the same decade. That's the end of the revolutionary fervor for now. The United States beat down another revolution with smothering it with a carpet. But I can guarantee you there'll be another one coming up soon. And there'll be more bodies and more blood. It's just going to go on and on and on. We have no interest in seeing the peasants own their land. We have no interest in dissolving any businesses or corporations that we own in those countries, because they're seen as profit makers, I think. And profit makers cannot be in any way disturbed. This speech gave me a chance to vent my true feelings about the situation, and I desperately needed it, because in my heart, I have hearts, I didn't know if I was going to survive this movie, succeed, because The Hand had been brutal, as had Seizure. Both were one-shot deals, and there was no follow-up. So I was ready to take the punch again and not make a film for a while. So I said, this may be it. I may never have a chance to say what I got to say on film, right? So you say what you got to say about what you feel, and put it in, and fuck it. You're not trying to get Academy Awards or anything. You're just trying to say what you say. So I have Boyle really say sort of my dream speech, which is what you can never say in reality, because you'd be cut off. You'd be heckled, or you'd be questioned. I mean, it wouldn't happen this way, but it's beautiful to see it in the movies where you can just sort of do it once in a while, try to push it. And I think in the theater, certainly, we got away with it. People liked the speech a lot. And it stands out still to me. I kept doing little speeches like Greed, the Greed is Good speech in Wall Street and stuff like that. I enjoyed those things. It's a bit of the old drama, the love of language. But increasingly, it's harder to pull off because language is mistrusted. This was shot in Cuernavaca, because you can see one of those lovely gardens, Cuernavaca gardens, in which they're sitting. There was dozens and dozens of those in this beautiful old city. I do examine it. I'm sorry. I love Colby Chester. He's very Princeton, and he actually comes from the East Coast, but he's not at all a moneyed family, but he's one of those actors who conveys that. Very nice man. I think he's working in TV. Colby, a real gentleman. If I were doing Gatsby, he'd certainly have to be somewhere in there. Whereas Will with his cigar and his horseshoe tie, we're all crazy, aren't we? Where else but in a film like this would you try something like this? Hey, it's a Western, It's an early period Western. I like Westerns. I think the next round of films will be Return to Simplicity. The basic stories will abound. I think they already have.
This is Pauline Axelrod, ANS News, San Salvador.
Well, listen, got one thing going for you.
Well, that wasn't great acting. I missed that. I blinked. Should have gotten another angle on that one. I should probably run out of time that day. It was a crush every day. As I said, I was amazing how good the film still looks. Richardson did a great job with lighting with very little time. Wilma. She stumbled into our lives one day. I guess when you make a film, there's a destiny. People come in and they're right. People just wander into your life. They find their way into a movie, and then they move on. They're nomads in other people's imaginations. Cowboys and Indians. Dreams. Beautiful landscape. Great car, huh? I used to have a red Mustang. Got too many cop tickets, so I went to a black Mustang. I've had black Mustangs for 3 of them now in a row. From the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I still have my 89 one. Can you believe I have an 89 Mustang in 2001? I like Mustangs. They're very muscle cars. They accelerate fast. So if you live in a city, that's what you want. Small car, park easy, quick acceleration. And drive like one of those V8s, it feels like a souped up car, but it doesn't make noise, It feels like you got power underneath you. And it takes a hit. It can take a hit. It's got a lot of metal. So even Boyle drives a Mustang. That's great recommendation. For me, like Boyle can drive a Mustang. He loses car keys every day. Oh yeah, this was a nightmare to block, but we did it. This is one shot. Goes all the way down, staged with Mexicans, interpreter, ADs. Then we come around, boom, back this way, see more background. Hopefully we can swing around. This is early Steadicam or handheld. I don't know if Steadicam existed in those days. Feels like Bob handheld to me. Absolutely. I don't think we had Steadicam till The Doors. No, excuse me, we had it on Born on the 4th of July, low mode. We used a lot of low mode. So maybe around the time of talk radio it came in, about 88. Nice handheld shot. Bob was a good handheld cameraman, his own operator, which I liked. Makes it singular, more economical in outfit. You move faster, generally. There are drawbacks to it. You start to think too much. You become less of an operator, it's complicated. It's a whole relationship thing. This is my ode to Westerns, and I love south of the border, Gringos in Mexico, Westerns, the best. Peck and Paws, The Getaway, Wild Bunch, Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, and thousands of others. Even the Veracruz was great. Burt Lancaster, Gary Cooper, and Valdez is coming. No, the one was Richard Brooks did the Professionals. It's wonderful, a Western. Lee Marvin, Jack Palance, Burt Lancaster, Claudia Cardinale. This is hard stuff to shoot. As you see, he just got hit by the rifle. He really did. And unlike the Jimmy, he didn't complain this time, but he certainly did after the take. He knew he was on camera, so he didn't want to call cut. He could have been bleeding to death. I hope he takes this with a grain of salt. A lot of those detonations are happening. It's pretty heavy, and we shot it with a long lens, but you'll see that John Savage stayed out there longer than necessary. It was still dangerous. Everything was dangerous. Especially driving horses through cobbled streets. It was riskier than I thought. And these are tough horses. Here he comes, right here. He's going to stay out there longer than he has to. As you can see, they're almost on top of him. But they ended up for a better shot. Rightly, I was criticized for having staged this attack on horseback. It was not on horseback, it was on foot. But as many people who've been in Salvador say, it should have been on horseback because the rebels did use a lot of horses and donkeys for transportation and for supplies and for a lot of their operation. But they didn't use donkeys and horses in battle. It was too dangerous and risky. They weren't trained for battle, I don't think, and it would have been a disaster. But I was romantic at heart, and look at the footage that's upcoming and decide for yourself if it's in the spirit of the film or not. I think it is. Apparently there was a showdown between White and some of the embassy personnel, but I don't have any of the dialogue, and this is fictionalized. Boyle and I running it through our minds several times. The music is beautiful. This group, this folkloric group, we located after a long search. We'd been tipped off to who they were. It took Bud Carr, our music supervisor, several months to locate them and make a deal, a contract, in wherein they gave us the rights to many of their songs to use in the movie. But they were, unfortunately, they were tracked down by the government later. They had been working out of a collective of rebels and working for progress and solidarity, and they were killed. Some of them were killed, one very grotesquely by having a guitar stuffed down his throat. The concept of history, it's interesting to me because I often find it's subverted and used by the right wing as an argument against the left, and in the sense that they'll say, how do you want to go down in the history books or historically your perspective? They always talk in terms of this long view, which is a conservative point of view, but there's no room for change in there. That's why the short view sometimes makes for change. It's the Boyles of the world that fuck up the systems that make for change. It's no question that Boyle's an agitator and a pain in the ass, and you wouldn't want him in your living room for more than a few nights. Unfortunately, I had him for about a month straight, trying to write a script with him. My wife went nuts at the time, and after he drank the baby formula, thinking it was the last beer in the icebox, we found him at dawn, stretched out on one of our chairs, rocking back and forth in front of a live TV. My wife had enough, and she said, he's got to go. So Richard went, but we made the film instead. That was better. I don't think she ever approved of the film either. Nice handheld shot by Bob. It came around all the way, and the special effects went off in time. Timing was all. In those days, I used to blow the special effects myself in Platoon and Salvador. Did a lot of, mostly Platoon. Just enjoyed the timing. Timing. I enjoyed it like an art form, sort of like playing tennis, eye-to-hand coordination. I think I got a little carried away here, trying to be Eisenstein's Alexander Nevsky with the music. But hey, it's a Western. You can do what you want. This is the town we blew up. Playa Capan really blew it up. I'm telling you, we made a mess of this place. And the idea was horses go up against tanks. That was the chance they had, It was a romantic idea, but it's sort of true. George Delarue wrote the music and did a wonderful job. I think that's a very interesting score because there's a lot of variety to it, a lot of contortionism, like Woods' nervous performance. You see the great physicality of Woods. The same thing is true of Delarue, who's in the later age. He's in his 60s now. A wonderful little man, very gentle, very, very easy to get along with, very nice for me. We shared many thoughts. He's French, and we spoke a lot. Wonderful wife in Colette. He just wrote a score that was sharp, very sharp, combined with the folklorics. But you can see we made quite a mess in this town, and the mayor was happy as can be because there's a lot of money, I guess, for him, for his town, and it's a very sad image, and there was a lot of that in South America. A lot of burned children, Jesus. Took a lot to finesse this plane to come in. And we weren't renting from a $1 a day factory. This was expensive, but we did it barely. I was worried that the plane would hit the telephone wires and actually kill John because he was out in the middle of the street. We were firing slingshots off the walls, not squibs to save money, but it works on dry, dusty places like that. There's a great look, by the way, that John gives it. A lot of people like that look. In hindsight, I would have done a few things differently. One thing, from this, it would appear that he's about to try to get a shot of it as evidence for the Americans that the government of Salvador has been using these airplanes against the rebels. But it doesn't seem strong enough in hindsight to me. I wish that the pictures that he had sought would be more of an artistic kind, like Kappa had shot. This scene was very shocking, and still is. The sound of the trachea being opened. We had no military advisor. It was suggested by, I think, John Savage as an alternative way to die, and I think it was a great idea. Hard to watch for me. I think there are nice flesh tones here, incredible colors, kind of grit that you could probably get now through digital, but in those days it was depending on the light conditions and the sun that day, the way it fell on their faces with the grime on it, really powerful. And the way Bob positioned it, lit it. If you remember, Belushi's been out of the story for a while, so he comes back in as a framing device in a way. It kind of brings us to another tonality after going off into a dramatically tragic mode. So the movie ends on the escape note of Midnight Express and Papillon and some of those great films that escape movies that have been in tradition in Hollywood. In Midnight Express, we didn't do the escape. But we had a scene that was written that would have been a great escape if it had been shot. Again, I love picking these faces, but they were so funny. They're the Mexican casting agency. They're in Mexico City. I'm sure these people have played in dozens of movies, many of them before, because that's, of course, Bob Marone's on the right. That's our casting director from Los Angeles. This little fellow reminded me of a Chilean torturer. So I picked him, and this fellow was great. The guy with the Oakland Raiders t-shirt looked like Pablo Escobar. I think we're trying to have fun, trying to have some fun with all this. So it's funny because that's part of me wants to be the messenger of a need for change in Central America, and the other part of me is having fun inside that system because the system is corrupt in a way. And part of me wants to be Richard Boyle, just wants to go off and have fun. Has fun with the whole thing because if you took it so seriously, you'd go nuts. Everything would be a Carl Dreyer film or a Robert Bresson film, it would be studying behavior. There's no laughter. And I think Salvador, one of the things was fun to many people, not everyone, was his concept of humor. It made people laugh. People forget that. Those people who don't like my work, they always say, he's humorless, but they don't look at the films. Because from here back to Scarface, I had outrage after outrage, but it was also done in the same spirit of anarchy, and there was a sense of humor about it, whether you saw it or not. You missed it. And also in Wall Street, Natural Born Killers. it goes on and on. It's become very controversial because some people didn't think it was funny at all, the Natural Born Killer. It's hard for me to buy that, but, that's true. Some people just don't get my humor. I can only just do what I do. But this is a little over the top. But that was one of my first movies, and probably that's why some people like it more, because it's more outrageous. It's easier to read. And who's to say movies have to be harder to read? Part of their function is to be as easy to read as possible. That's not to say that's the only reason you make movies. You do both. You do simple and complex if you can. I bet you Thomas Mann would have loved to have written Bambi, saved by the assistant in white. This young lady was down there as originally as a girlfriend of one of the members of the cast. Eventually she was cast in a movie in a small role as the ambassador's assistant. She was very good. And I think after the movie was over, she broke up with this member of the cast. Key moment for Richard Boyle. Boy, oh boy. This is hard to believe. It's a little Hollywood, but it does pull people in the theater. Jesus. Even the rifle that's supposed to kill him misfires. How lucky can Boyle get? He dodges the bullet, so to speak. And he's saved by the ambassador with moral authority that he lacks. So Boyle may help the ambassador to see the light, but the ambassador will never follow in Boyle's path, whereas Boyle is about to die in his path when the ambassador saves him from his path. But the corollary is that the ambassador's path is doomed, and Reaganism wins and loses at the same time. So everyone wins and loses in the end. We all wash up into another century and the saga continues. And we wash into the next century and become somebody else and something else, and ideas bounce back and forth, and repetitions occur, and experiences never learned from. And the old ball game changes camouflages. So he makes it. So we think. But anyone who knows movies knows that the engine sound implies something else is going to happen. There's some genuine moments in this scene that Jimmy lost it, and he lost his line, and we used it. I'll show you as we come on. There's a sort of a false beat that comes in the movie. I left it in the editing, and many accidents I leave in the editing. I always like accidents because it throws the actors and reveals them for a moment as they truly are. I wanted somebody to look like Eric Estrada from Chips. I found him because I hated that show so much in the 70s. I hated all the cop shows when they catch the bad guys. There was no bad guys that were winning in television wars. So they had to make a few movies about bad guys who win. That's why I think everybody likes Treasure of the Sierra Madre. It's one of the great cynical movies of all time. And it's truly won all the awards. It was a great cynical movie, though, where everybody's a hard-bitten gang, you know? So the guy from Chips fucks up the holiday from Nogales. Don't you want to kill some guy like this?
Send her back. They will kill her. They will rape her, and they will mutilate her if you send her back there, Maria!
And they were doing this. This is real. Sending Salvadorans back. Either it was the INS doing their proper job, or the Reagan doctrine would not allow for political refugees from Salvador. The actual Maria, according to Boyle, washed up in Guatemala. Last day of the shoot, this is the day that the guy ran off with a negative. This is one of our last shots as the sun is going down, you can see. Oh, what a relief to finish that day. I didn't care where the negative went. I was just dead and happy to finish this thing and have it in the can, so to speak, if not developed. This is the last shot, actually. I think it is. Yep. The sun is down now. Seeing Bob ducks under the mountain here to avoid it and back up. We probably positioned the car right where the sun went down. I wanted something, big, sweeping, wide as we could get it. We had no crane, nothing big. Just we got on the back of the dolly and probably just across. We dollied across and went up. Jose Carlos Ruiz was the Archbishop Romero. Ramon Menendez, by the way, I forgot to say, went on to direct his own movie. Shortly thereafter, he did Stand and Deliver. There was a great Mexican crew. Working with them was a delight. Even though they struck, I understand why. They weren't being paid right. But I loved working with them because it was like they had a history, a tradition of having worked on the A films in their country for a while. So it had been a while since anything really special had come down their way, and they were very grateful for this film, as small as it was, difficult as it was. I felt there was true love coming from them back towards us, wanting to see the film succeed, and what else can you ask for? So everything against us, in a certain sort of way, it worked for us, I guess that's the theme to me of that movie. It was just, when I think of Salvador, I think of tremendous obstacles and overcoming them. Just the sheer difficulty, the sheer face of the rock cliff, climbing a huge monster and doing it one step at a time, not trying to think too big because, it was too dangerous, it was too hard. And it was also, I guess, my first, I had two other experiences that were quite major in their own way because they involved large crews, one in Canada, in Seizure, and the other one in Los Angeles in 1981, and 1980, The Hand. And that had been a studio film at a smaller budget. It had a $3 million budget, I think. So $3 million, about the same as Salvador 4 years later. And this budget was for a lot of locations. So the Salvador budget was too small for what we had to do. It became, for me, the baptism by fire that people talk about. It was so tough. And yet, there was a cockiness, too, in the way we did it, and the way I was thinking, the way we approached things. It was a can-do situation. I can do this. I am good enough to do this, which is arrogance, I suppose, of the young, of people who don't know better, who haven't failed enough. But I had failed a lot, believe me. So, you have to have some pride or some hope of being good, some belief in yourself. Otherwise, you would wilt under the pressures of negativity and obstacles. I think you got to fight, and in a way, you have to be blind. I think blindness is a part of it. That you can do things because you're blind and you don't know why you can't do them. It sounds paradoxical. It seems like you have to jump over a cliff with a blindfold on, you know. You don't think it's fair, but somehow when you jump over that cliff, believe it or not, your freedom lies on the other side.